Now, a United Nations committee is looking at South Africa's track record when it comes to health and education, two big issues. This week, Equal Education and the Equal Education Law Centre presented a report to that UN Committee on Economic, Cultural and Social Rights via video link. Equal Education is a movement of learners, parents, teachers and other members of the community. Well, to discuss, we're joined from Seapoint by legal advisor at Equal Education Law Centre, Mbekezeli Benjamin. From our Seapoint studio, Mbekezeli, thank you for being with us. So the importance of this UN committee and its investigation, who will be looking at the findings?
Well, several people will be looking at the findings. The first is the committee that is appointed by the UN, that is made up of human rights experts. But there's also civil society organizations who participated in the process. They are looking at whatever outcomes will come out of the committee quite closely. But it also is of interest internationally. Other countries are looking at what South Africa has done. And then there's also domestically in South Africa, we are also looking at what the country is saying about the human rights record on education, on health, on land, on food, and other socio-economic rights.
So this affects the way South Africa is viewed, and really it's about dignity, it's about how we treat people, how our democracy works.
Indeed so. Our democracy is founded, for example, on the respect for human rights, on the achievement of human dignity and equality for all. So our track record on human rights speak to those constitutional values, the founding values of a democratic South Africa. So our achievements or our failures or successes in progress or progress on human rights is very much important to us because it is part of our founding values as a nation.
So you presented a plethora of impediments, it seems, to the constitutional right to basic education. Let's not forget it's as stark as children still going to school and drowning in a pit latrine.
Indeed. So on Monday, we presented a report which focused on education. That spoke to issues of children drowning in pit latrines and identified some of the causes of those problems. And one of the causes is a lack of implementation of the infrastructure requirements by law and also a lack of proper budgeting. Over the past 10 years or so, we've seen gradual cuts into the education infrastructure budget, and currently the biggest cut was in the current budget. And so those are the issues that we raised with the International Committee, and the government was required to provide a response to that on Tuesday and Wednesday. We also raised issues relating to other aspects of education. For example, scholar transport, that there are many learners, particularly in KZN, Eastern Cape and other rural provinces, who still walk very long distances to and from school. And so the committee also took that issue and asked the government to respond to it before the committee. So there were a number of issues in education that were touched on, and some of those the government did provide a response. A lot of which we believe the response was not adequate. For example, on the issue of budgets, the government said yes, we are in a tight fiscal space, and so there's not much that can be done. But there were other civil society organizations that showed that more could be done to address the budgeting issues.
Yeah. Well, let's just bring out the stat. 8,700 schools across the country still use pit latrines, even if it's not the main toilets being used. Government always says that it's doing its best, but there is limited finances. Why is that not good enough for you?
Well, the issue in most cases is not only an issue of funding. There are many provinces like Limpopo, like the Eastern Cape, for example, that had been allocated funding to deal with issues of pit latrines in school. But those provinces have sent money back to Treasury. So it's not only an issue of budgeting. There is an issue relating to proper planning, proper implementation of those plans, and proper implementation of projects to improve school infrastructure generally, but sanitation in particular. So that's why you see this constant prevalence of pit latrines that are below the standards required of anyone to be using the toilet.
I see you've touched on another issue that's being talked about increasingly in South Africa, menstrual hygiene products in schools, and you're saying government simply has no policy, no laws in place there.
Yes, unfortunately, menstrual hygiene is an issue that has really captured the attention of the country in recent times, which is good. But it's sad that the government has not developed a policy that speaks to feminine hygiene, menstruation, and sanitation generally. So that is something that we have flagged as a concern with the government, and so we've also raised it with the UN committee on Monday.
What would a policy like that look like?
So a policy that would speak to menstrual hygiene, for example, is on how do schools ensure that learners are kept in school when they're going through their period. The menstrual hygiene policy would also speak to how, if it happens that a learner misses school because of their menstrual period, what plans are in place to ensure that the learner catches up on the period of time that they've missed out in school, and that they are actually brought up to speed with regards to that. But it also speaks about sanitation and dignity as a whole. It's not only about the menstrual period or the menstrual hygiene of learners, but it also speaks generally to sanitation.
Finally, if there was real political will, do you think we as a country would be meeting that basic constitutional obligation of a right to basic education? We've been talking about all the things that hinder that.
Yes, political will is a key ingredient in ensuring that we as a country are able to meet the standards of human rights required by our constitution, but required by international instruments like the treaty that South Africa has signed. So there is a great deal of political will that is necessary, for example, to ensure that there are proper plans in place, proper policies in place, proper budgeting happens, and that projects that are linked to that are actually implemented until the end. Yeah. So there is a great deal of political will that is necessary to ensure that we are able to achieve what is required from us with regards to education and other rights generally.
Finally, Mr. Benjamin, it must be hard for the UN looking at a country trying to figure out exactly the extent of these hindrances. They heard from you. What sort of questions did they ask? They heard from government. Do you think they will be able to get a good picture of what is going on?
I do believe that the committee already has a firm grasp on some of the issues that we have here in South Africa. There were a lot of questions that were asked to the government. On education alone, for example, they asked about this issue of the funding of education. What impact does the austerity measures that the government has taken have on education? They asked very specifically on that. They asked on the question, for example, of scholar transport again, whether government has proper plans in place and what have they implemented those plans. They also asked on the issue facing undocumented learners, so children without birth certificates or children from other countries, and whether they are accessing education. Because we found, for example, that some of them don't have access to education. Schools turn them away because they don't have documentation. The community zoomed in on that. But even beyond education, the committee, for example, asked on the question of the land and on evictions on farms, what the government is doing to prevent evictions on farms. They also asked, finally, on the question of the VAT increase and what measures are in place to protect the poor people from the VAT increase. So there were a number of questions that were asked from the government.
All right, so it sounds like they're looking very broadly. Thank you very much, Mbekezeli Benjamin from Equal Education, legal advisor at Equal Education Law Centre, and we'll await that report from the UN Committee on Economic, Cultural and Social Rights, basically looking at the state of our infrastructure, schooling, health, things like that in South Africa. We take a short break. We'll be back.